Good morning, class. Welcome to your first session of Remote Lit Comp. We are going to be diving into Dante's Inferno. You may feel like you're already there, but I think that this is a really timely, this is a good book to be reading right now because it's a story of conversion. It's a story about a man being found in the darkness of the world and the darkness of sin, God reaching into that with grace and through supernatural aid, taking him through a vision that's going to transform him, showing him the whole breadth of the gospel from hell to heaven. And so the Divine Comedy is composed of three major sections: the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. We're going to be reading the first section, the Inferno. Junior year, you get to read the Purgatorio. And so the Inferno, as you could have guessed, is hell. And each section, except for the Inferno, is 33 books. The Inferno is 34. And so you can think of Canto 1, which we're about to read together, as the preface to the entire comedy. Here we're going to get a setup. We're going to see where Dante begins in the story. We're going to see the projection of where he's going to be, and who's going to guide him through that. So if you're not already dressed and ready to learn, then you can pause the video and go get ready. But you can feel lucky that you're not having to be in your uniform right now. That's one plus. I've got my cup of coffee right here for our leisurely learning. Have in front of you your book, your pen or pencil, and you can be writing in your book as we read through Canto 1 together. Okay, so let's begin with line 1. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, che la diritta via era smarrita. That was the Italian. First 3 lines. Something very significant about the Divine Comedy is that it was written in the vernacular. At this time, during the early 1300s AD, everything that was serious scholarship had to be written in Latin. And to not meant that you were doing something very radical. Dante is really the pioneer of writing in the vernacular at this time. And the vernacular refers to the language of the common people. This is the language that people would have spoken if they weren't among the class of the elite or the scholarly class. And so for Dante to write in Italian is very significant. It means this is a story that he wants the world to know, not just the elite. So we're going to begin again with the English, our vernacular. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wilderness, for I'd wandered from the straight and true. How hard a thing it is to tell about that wilderness so savage, dense, and harsh. Even to think of it renews my fear. So we begin. First word, midway. What does that make you think of? What literary device? Should be in media res, right? We begin in the middle of things. In the middle of his life, but not just his life. What does he say? He says, our life. This is a story about humanity, not just Dante himself. And so when we refer to Dante, we're referring not just to Dante the author, but also Dante the character. He's a character in his own story. So, but he's writing this on behalf of humanity. So constantly, we're going to be reading this text in a devotional mindset. That means that this isn't literary criticism. We're not attempting to pick apart this story so that we can understand its separate parts as if we were doing a, No, that you do on a dead person in order to figure out why they died.
Autopsy.
Autopsy. We're not doing an autopsy on this text. We're attempting to maintain its life and allow its life to affect our own. So we're constantly trying to put ourselves in Dante's position and think, what was he thinking in this moment? And how do I think the same way? And what does God want to do with that? So, midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wilderness, for I had wandered from the straight and true. I found myself. That's an active verb, right? I found. Dante himself found himself. Does that make you think that, the question I have for you is, who do you think Dante thinks is the main actor in his life? Who's the main agent in his life? Himself, right? He's really the one getting things done right now. I found myself in a dark wilderness, for I had wandered from the straight and true. Now that's referencing the straight and true. Should bring scripture to mind. That's Matthew 7:14, referring to the way of the righteous is the straight and true. And all of a sudden, Dante realizes that he's not on that path right now. And this is the way sin works, right? You don't notice the first time you wander off the straight and true. You notice it after one decision leads to another decision, leads to another decision, and all of a sudden you realize you're way off the path. So he finds himself in a dark wilderness, and I want you to be a little bit skeptical of the way he judges his own situation right now. He's probably not the one responsible for his sudden consciousness, for his sudden awareness of where he is. Who's the person that gives light to us? Who's the person that allows us to have spiritual vision? It's God, right? So whenever Dante seems to think that he's the one getting the work done, we should be a little bit skeptical because it's God. God gives him the grace to do this. How hard I think it is to tell about that wilderness, so savage, dense, and harsh. Even to think of it renews my fear. This is a place of fear. Dante's mind right now is a place of fear. It is so bitter. Death is hardly more. Death is hardly more bitter than his experience at this point. So if we're thinking about this story as a story of spiritual journey, what causes bitterness? What makes our life bitter? Is it our circumstances? Let's think about track for a second, since I like to relate everything to track, being a track coach. Yes, track is objectively painful. But what makes track bitter for some and not others is their approach to it, right? Some people, like myself and some other tracksters out there, the pain of track is actually itself a delight, is a joy, right? Within the sport itself, it brings joy. And so it's not the circumstances that determine the bitterness, it's your attitude towards it, right? And so the bitterness of this wilderness is sin. And he says death is hardly more bitter than sin. But he doesn't know he's talking about sin because he's in it, right? He can't see it himself. And that's what sin does, it clouds our vision. Scripture tells us, however, that the way of unrighteousness, the way of sin, is more bitter than death. The world constantly wants us to believe this lie that death is the worst thing that can happen to us. And you see that more than ever right now as people are worried about the pandemic, right? People are thinking about the possibility that they might die. And that is extremely bitter to them, and they can't imagine anything worse than that. Scripture tells us, however, that death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. Separation from God is the worst thing that can happen to us. But Dante doesn't understand that yet. But to reveal the good news that came to me, I shall relate the other things I saw. How I had entered, I can't bring to mind. You can't remember the first time that he strew off the path. I was so full of sleep just at that point when I first left the way of truth behind. So now I'm going to have y'all look here at a quote from C.S. Lewis, which comes from the preface to The Great Divorce. So let's look at this for a second. Blake, referring to William Blake, not myself, wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. This is a book that C.S. Lewis is responding to in The Great Divorce. Lewis writes, "If I have written of their divorce, this is not because I think myself a fit antagonist for so great a genius," referring to William Blake, "nor even because I feel at all sure that I know what he meant. But in some sense or other, the attempt to make that marriage is perennial, meaning people try to make heaven and hell seem like the same thing all the time, and they're constantly trying to do it. The attempt is based on the belief that reality never presents us with an absolutely unavoidable either or. That, granted skill and patience, and above all, time enough, some way of embracing both alternatives can always be found. That mere development or adjustment or refinement will somehow turn evil into good without our being called on for a final and total rejection of anything we should like to retain." So what Lewis is saying here, and we're not quite done with him, but what Lewis is saying is that, trying to figure out this technology, y'all, is that we like to, as much as possible, try to make heaven and hell seem like the same thing. Because we like to keep our little bit of sin, we like to keep the goods of heaven, and so if we can marry those two things, if we can keep them together, then that's going to be the most ideal situation, because we really don't like to give up what we don't like to give up. And we don't want an unavoidable either or. And this is what Lewis is going to argue for in The Great Divorce, which you will also read as juniors. That you have to choose heaven or hell. And here's how he's going to continue to explain this. This belief I take to be a disastrous error. You cannot take all luggage with you on all journeys. On one journey, even your right hand and your right eye may be among the things you have to leave behind. We are not living in a world where all roads are radii of a circle, and where all, if followed long enough, will therefore draw gradually nearer and finally meet at the center. Rather in a world where every road, after a few miles, forks in two, and each of those into two again. And at each fork you must make a decision. Even on the biological level, life is not like a pool but like a tree. It does not move towards unity but away from it, and the creatures grow further apart as they increase in perfection. Good, as it ripens, becomes continually more different, not only from evil, but from other good. I do not think that all who choose wrong roads perish, but their rescue consists in being put back on the right road. A wrong sum can be put right, but only by going back till you find the error and working it afresh from that point, never by simply going on. Evil can be undone, but it cannot develop into good. Time does not heal it. The spell must be unwound bit by bit, with backward mutters of dissevering power, or else not. It is still either or. If we insist on keeping hell or even earth, we shall not see heaven. If we accept heaven, we shall not be able to retain even the smallest and most intimate souvenirs of hell. So, you may have thought most of that went over my head, and I have no idea. So let's try to unpack it. He uses the analogy of a tree. Life is like a tree. If you start at the trunk, then as you grow and grow and go onwards and onwards, you start to run into branches. You can choose to go one way or the other, and you're constantly facing new forks in the road with decisions to make. And there's one path that's the straight and narrow. There's one path of righteousness that leads to heaven. As you sin, then you stray from that path. Does he say you can't get back on the path after that? No. He says you can, but you can't continue this way. You have to go back to where the fork happened and make a new choice and get back on the straight and narrow. So this analogy helps us understand how Dante came to find himself in this dark wood. He made one little decision that led him away from God. And at first it seemed like it wasn't really that far from the straight and narrow. So he continued on it for a while. And then he made another decision that led him farther away, and another decision, and another decision. And all of a sudden he woke up one day and realized, wait, I'm way over here, and the straight and narrow is way over here. How'd I get so far? But it only started with this slight degree change. And, right, if you have a small angle at the point where those two lines meet, it seems like it doesn't make a big difference. But if you carry those lines onto infinity, then the angle looks huge. That's exactly how the moral life is. And so he's going to need an intervention. He's going to need somebody to pick him up and get him back onto the straight and narrow. In his life, in his soul, he has to undo all of that bad work that he did to take him away from the straight and narrow. And so that's what this journey is going to be. It's going to be undoing the effect of sin on his soul and producing virtue there instead, producing a desire to be with God instead. Okay, so where were we? Line 13. But when I reached the foot of a high hill, right where the valley opened to its end, the valley that had pierced my heart with fear, I raised my eyes and saw its shoulders robed with the rays of that wandering light of heaven. That's the sun. And we know who the sun represents. That leads all men aright on every road. That quieted a bit the dread that stirred trembling within the waters of my heart, all through that night of misery I endured. And here comes our first simile. We're going to see lots of these. As a man with labored breathing drags his legs out of the water and ashore, fixes his eyes upon the dangerous sea, so too my mind, while still a fugitive, turned back to gaze again upon that pass which never let a man escape alive. So when I see this simile, immediately I'm thinking of Prince Eric, obviously, from The Little Mermaid. Prince Eric is rescued by Ariel from certain death, from drowning. And he wakes up on the beach and he's looking around and he's thinking, how on earth did I get here? He has no idea, right? But he looks back out to the sea and he thinks, how did I make it out of there alive? And he's tired and he needs rest. And remember, Dante had claimed to have found himself. But he found himself in the same way Prince Eric found himself. He didn't really do that much to save his own soul. All he did was eventually wake up. But Ariel, and in our case, in the Inferno, God is the one that did the saving, is the one that's responsible for even this tiny glimpse and glimmer of consciousness, of self-awareness of what he's doing and where he is now. So this man with labored breathing looks back out into the dangerous sea and objectively from the outside sees now what he just barely escaped. So to my mind, while still a fugitive, turned back to gaze again upon that past which never let a man escape alive. Except he just escaped alive. So maybe he's giving a little bit too much credit to the powers of the world, right? What seems unstoppable to us, what the forces of evil that seem impossible to be overcome, that always grasp humanity within its clutches and never let it go. A pandemic that seems like it's not going to that we're not going to survive, or that's going to hold the fear of the world in its clutches forever, seems to be unstoppable. God is fully capable of addressing those concerns. And so don't let us think too highly of the powers of this world. When I had given, again, a lot of active verbs on the part of Dante, when I had given my weary body rest, I struck again over the desert slope, ever the firmer foot the one below. And look, just where the steeper rise began, here comes our first very important and famous allegorical animal of Canto 1, a leopard. So make a note of that. A leopard, light of foot and quick to lunge, all covered in a pelt of flecks and spots, who stood before my face and would not leave, but did so check me in the path I trod. I often turned to go the way I came. So it's often considered by scholars that the leopard is here to represent the sin of lust, and the broader category of sin known as the flesh. So there are three classes of sins that we're going to see represented by three different animals on this page right here. The leopard's the first. So lust, this is the first obstacle that threatens his life. And what's interesting about Dante's use of allegory for sin here is he gets to conceive of sin as something that's out of his control. Right? This is an obstacle that he's coming face to face with. And he's not responsible for this leopard jumping in front of his path and threatening his life. Right? This leopard is nothing that he can control. And this is the evil force. It's not coming from within himself. And we're going to continue to think about whether that is exactly true or not. The hour was morning at the break of dawn. The sun was mounting higher with those stars that shone beside him with the love divine. In the beginning made their beauty move, and so they were a cause of hope for me to get free of that beast of flashy hide. The waking hour in that sweet time of year, but hope was not so strong that I could stand bold when a lion stepped before my eyes. So here comes our second animal of a lion. We've got a leopard, now a lion. And the lion is going to represent pride. So we've got lust and now pride. And the class of sin that this falls under is the devil. So the devil is responsible and represented by this class of sin. This one seemed to be coming straight for me, his head held high, prideful. His hunger hot with wrath seemed to strike tremors in the very air. Then a she-wolf, this is our third animal, whose scrawniness seemed stuffed with all men's cravings, sluggish with desires, who had made many live in wretchedness. The she-wolf represents avarice, and the class of sin that this belongs to is the world. So we've now got lust, pride, avarice, and the flesh, the devil, and the world. So heavily she weighed my spirit down, pressing me by the terror of her glance. I lost all hope to gain the mountaintop. Lost all hope? He's barely just begun. And he's already lost hope. So, regarding the character arc of Dante, we are starting at the very bottom. He's not ready to overcome any challenge. He thinks that everything that gets in his way is an immovable force, and he's lacking all trust. So already he's lost hope. And here comes our second simile. And as a gambler, winning with a will, happening on the time when he must lose, turns all his thoughts to weeping and despair, so I, by that relentless beast, who came against me step by step and drove me back to where the sun is silent evermore. So Dante compares himself to a gambler. Already, not encouraging. Winning with a will. So when a gambler's winning, he thinks that he is unstoppable, right? He thinks that he's on his way to becoming the wealthiest person in the world, and as soon as he wins, he wants to put his money back in and win more. It seems like his confidence is huge. But when all of a sudden, when he's faced with the possibility that he's about to lose, he then so easily, in a flash, turns his thoughts to weeping and despair. So this is what happens when you put your confidence in the world. Christ is the only true cornerstone, right? And so as you can see, Dante has not built anything on this foundation. His foundation is like sinking sand. And so quickly he gives up. But does he take responsibility? No. He blames that relentless beast who drove against me step by step and drove me back. No responsibility. And we're going to learn that the first step to growth is the ability to recognize your own sin and repent. Next page. Now, while I stumbled to the deepest wood, before my eyes appeared the form of one who seemed hoarse, having held his word so long. And when I saw him in that endless waste, "Mercy upon me, mercy!" I cried out. "Whatever you are, a shade or man in truth." You can just imagine how pathetic Dante seems right now, stumbling in the dark. He answered me, "No man. I was a man, and both my parents came from Lombardy and Mantua, they called their native land. In the last days of Julius Caesar, I was born, and lived in Rome under the good Augustus. In the time of the false and cheating gods, I was a poet, and sang of how that just son of Anchises came from Troy, when her proud towers and walls were burnt to dust. But you, why do you turn back to such pain? Why don't you climb that hill that brings delight, the origin and cause of every joy?" So, if you can keep yourself from reading the next line, who do you think this is? We studied him in history. This is Virgil. And we're going to see that Virgil is Dante's hero. Now, Dante the poet is himself, obviously, a poet, and regards the work of Virgil so highly. And we're going to see maybe a little bit too highly. "Then are you Virgil? And that spring swelling into so rich a stream of verse?" I answered him, my forehead full of shame. "Honor and light of every poet, may my long study avail me, and the love that made me search the volume of your work. You are my teacher, my authority. You alone are the one from whom I took the style whose loveliness has honored me." So, he's a total fan and total groupie of Virgil. But he doesn't answer Virgil's question, does he? Virgil introduces himself and then looks to Dante and says, "But you, why do you turn back to such pain?" So is Virgil aware that Dante is responsible for his actions? Yes. Why don't you climb that hill that brings delight, the origin and cause of every joy? And that hill is the hill that's going to lead us to heaven. But already Dante's turning away from it, even in his self-awareness now. But let's look to the reason that Dante gives for his actions. He says, "See there, the beast that made me turn aside. Save me from her, O man renowned and wise. She sets the pulses trembling in my veins." So, what does Dante do? He points fingers. It's not my fault. It's the beast's fault. But Virgil replies, "It is another journey you must take," replied the poet when he saw me weep, "if you wish to escape this savage place. Because this beast that makes you cry for help never lets any pass along her way, but checks his path until she takes his life. So vicious is her nature, so ill-bent, she never stuffs her ravenous will enough, but after feeding hungers all the more. Many a living soul takes her to wife, and many shall, until the greyhound comes, he who will make her die in misery." So, Virgil is not a Christian, unfortunately. But he's going to be a dutiful guide to Dante. So he doesn't immediately say, "Dante, this is your fault. You're responsible for the position that you're in." He talks about the she-wolf as if she is a force to be reckoned with. And maybe this is a lesson for us about a persuasive way to talk to others about sin. This she-wolf, avarice, so vicious is her nature. She's so ill-bent that she never stuffs her will enough, but after feeding hungers all the more. Dante's probably not ready to hear that he's actually the cause of this avarice, that it's actually coming from within him. But if Virgil can teach him about the nature of avarice and what it does and how deathly it is, how the sin will always lead to doom, then when Dante gets to the point where he's able to recognize his own responsibility, then he'll desire fervently to turn away from it, knowing what it is. He says, "Many a living soul takes her to wife, and many shall." So this is referring to biblical imagery of the whore of Babylon. And so Babylon is a city in the Bible, which y'all should be familiar with, which even beyond its historical context is used as a symbol to represent the world and sin. So it's the city of man. It's where man sets himself up as God. And this expression of taking her to wife, meaning marrying her, committing yourself to the service of Babylon, choosing yourself over God. He says this is what many do until the greyhound comes, he who will make her die in misery. So who is the only one that can conquer the city of sin? The greyhound. Who do you think the greyhound is? I think you know. From this image of the greyhound, as we're going to see, goes very well with what we've studied to be the Hound of Heaven. The Hound of Heaven, as y'all remember, is a poem written by Francis Thompson that C.S. Lewis references a lot. And he uses this image of the Hound of Heaven to describe the way in which God pursues fervently his children and desires to bring them back into the fold. It's another way of talking about God as the shepherd that pursues the lost sheep, but it's a lot more, it appeals to the horror that the sheep feels in being pursued. It doesn't seem like a shepherd's pursuing you when you desire to stray. It feels like a hound is pursuing you until you're within his grasp and you realize that awful thing that was coming after you to clutch you, like in Flannery O'Connor's story, The Turkey, wasn't awful at all. Was actually loving and desiring to wrap you in a loving embrace. But it doesn't feel like that while you're still being pursued. So the greyhound is going to come, and he's going to strike the she-wolf down. He's going to strike the whore of Babylon down. The powers, the principalities of this world he'll strike down. Not land, not lucre will he feed upon, but wisdom, love, and strength shall be his meat. And by the cloth of felt he will be born. He will bring health to humbled Italy, the land for which the maid Camilla died, and Nisus, Turnus, and Euryalus. These are all Italian heroes. Nisus, Turnus, and Euryalus are all Virgil's Aeneid. Through every village he will hunt her down until at last he drives her back to hell, whence envy set her loose upon the world. And so I judge it would be best for you to follow me, and I will be your guide, leading you out through an eternal place, where you will hear the groans of hopeless men, will look upon the sorrowing souls of old, crying in torment for the second death. So where's this? This is hell. This is the first place they're going to go. Then you will look upon those souls content to wait in fire, because they hope someday to come among the nation of the blessed. This is Purgatory, the second book of the trilogy. Should you then wish to rise and go to them, another soul will come, worthier than I. With her I'll leave you when I go my way. This other soul that Virgil refers to here is Beatrice. Beatrice, in Dante the poet's real life, was a girl that he fell in love with, but admired from afar and idealized her as a representation of the blessedness of God. So if you want to talk about the most famous crush from a distance in world history, it's Dante and Beatrice. And so Beatrice died at a young age, but she continued in Dante's memory as a powerful image of the beauty of God, of the blessedness of God. And so in the Divine Comedy, he uses her as a figure that will eventually guide Dante, the character, into heaven. And so that's going to be her role. She is not an idol because of her own beauty, but she reflects the beauty of God to him. With her, I'll leave you when I go my way. For that great emperor who reigns above, God, because I was a rebel to his law, will not allow me entry to his realm. Everywhere he commands, from there he rules. There stand his city and his lofty throne. Happy the man he chooses for his house. And so this will be the third book of the trilogy, Heaven, Paradise. Poet, I said to him, I beg of you, by that same God you never knew, that I may flee this evil and the worst to come. Lead me now to the place you tell me of, so I may see St. Peter's gate, and those you say are dwelling in such misery. He set on, and I held my pace behind. And so we begin our journey, our spiritual journey through hell. So we're going to continue, as I said before, to read this devotionally. I'll have some reflections for y'all to complete as we go through this. We're going to try a few different formats, and hopefully soon we'll be able to do some live classroom experiences, because talking to myself is really sad. I really wish that we could all be together in the classroom together. But know that I'm praying for y'all, and I look forward to continue our semester.